August 1932. The Southern Pacific Rail Line cutting through the Gila Desert, Arizona. The temperature record hit 115 degrees that week. He walked the gravel ballast beside the tracks, watching a westbound freight train pass without slowing. Where were the others who had jumped off? He had ridden a blind baggage car out of Tucson before the railroad bulls chased him off at a water stop. Surviving the road in 1932 meant moving when you could and walking when you had to. But walking the Gila required water he didn't have. Let me tell you about the southwestern migration of 1932 because you need to understand it before you can understand what he was walking into. A quarter of the country was unemployed. Men were pouring toward California. The railroad was the only artery through the heat. The notes mention a shallow depression near mile marker 712. He stopped there. The county relief records from Yuma document dozens of transients who died of exposure that summer. He found a makeshift cross made of railroad spikes. Whose grave was it? To understand the unmarked grave, you have to look at what brought him to the desert. 3 days earlier, he was in the Tucson rail yards. The local vagrancy ordinances had tightened. Police were clearing the Hoovervilles. Staying meant jail. Moving meant the desert. He waited in the scrub brush as the yard engine coupled the cars. Southern Pacific detectives in 1932 were authorized to use physical force to clear transients from the lines. He caught the iron ladder just as the train cleared the yard limits. He was on. The space behind the coal tender was choked with hot ash. Riding the blind meant breathing cinder dust for hours while clinging to a shaking steel grate. He held on as the locomotive hammered westward, wondering how many miles his grip would last. The train braked hard at a desert water stop hours before dawn. Flashlights cut through the steam, followed by the sound of swinging clubs against wood. Railroad companies documented thousands of ejections at these remote stops, purposefully stranding men miles from any town. He dropped and ran. He found himself following the tracks on foot. In 1932, a single canteen of water at a remote desert station could cost a full day's wage if anyone would sell it to a transient. He had an empty glass bottle and 60 miles to walk. This is not the kind of thing that appears in official records. The railroad didn't document the men they abandoned in the heat, only the delays they caused. What we have is a notation in the margin, 4 numbers marking the telegraph poles he passed to stay awake. By dawn, the migration corridor revealed what it cost to cross it. He stepped over a canvas bedroll, then a cracked leather shoe. Leaving belongings meant giving up the past to survive the present. He kept walking as the heat began to rise from the steel. That was the road that brought him to mile marker 712. He stood over the cross, made of iron spikes again. Yuma County paid $15 for a pauper's burial in those years. But out here, the men buried their own. The dirt hadn't settled yet. His name does not appear in these notes, not once. Whether that was deliberate, or whether the notes simply never reached the pages where he wrote it, we don't know yet. If you want to be here when we find out, subscribe. The road continues. He looked past the mound toward a dry arroyo winding away from the line. Hidden from the view of passing conductors, a makeshift transient camp sat in the brush. Depression-era Quote 21 usually meant shared water and fire, but this camp was entirely silent. Period accounts from relief workers describe men who succumbed to desert exhaustion, men who stopped walking and simply sat down to wait. He approached the shadow of a stretched tarp. A solitary man sat beneath it, staring at the sand. He did not look up. He stepped into the shade. The man's lips were cracked and bleeding, a documented symptom of advanced dehydration. He pointed toward the freshly turned earth by the tracks. He didn't have the strength to say his partner's name. Would anyone ever know who lay there? Let me tell you about what 115 degrees does to a body, because it explains what he was walking into. Yuma County medical records documented heart failure within hours. The desert road didn't just exhaust a traveler, it baked them alive. How many hours did he have left? The seated man handed over a folded piece of railroad stationery. It was a Southern Pacific freight schedule from 1931, heavily marked in pencil. He pushed it toward the wanderer's boots. What did the penciled warnings actually mean? He unfolded the paper. A penciled circle marked a water tank 5 miles west, but another mark sat beside it, a drawn star. In hobo symbology of the era, a star meant railroad police were heavily stationed there. How desperate was the thirst? He looked back at the man under the tarp. The records show relief trucks never patrolled this deep into the Gila. Staying meant joining the man in the dirt. He folded the schedule and stepped back into the sun. Would the waiting man survive the afternoon? The heat coming off the steel rails distorted the horizon. Railroad engineers documented that daytime track temperatures could exceed 140 degrees, softening the creosote ties. Every step required calculated effort. How much further could a body go without water? He kept his eyes on the warped steel. The Southern Pacific maintained a rigid schedule despite the depression, moving California produce east. A whistle echoed against the canyon walls behind him. Would this engineer stop or speed up? An eastbound refrigerator train materialized through the heat haze. In 1932, crews were ordered to shoot steam at men walking the tracks to keep them away from the valuable cargo. He scrambled down the steep gravel embankment to hide. What would they do if they saw him? The ground shook as thousands of tons of steel and ice roared past him. He pressed his face against the dirt, breathing the acrid smell of hot brake shoes. He was entirely invisible to the men driving the engine. How long until the vibration stopped? When the dust settled, he climbed back up to the ballast. The pencil-marked water tank was still 3 miles away. A single mistake in timing the approach meant being caught by the railroad bulls. He began to walk. Who was guarding the water? A dead rattlesnake lay draped over the steel rail, baked dry by the morning sun. The county agricultural reports noted a severe drought driving wildlife toward the tracks for shade. He stepped over the brittle scales and kept moving. What else was hiding in the heat? He saw the black silhouette of the water tank through the heat waves. Southern Pacific records confirm armed guards manned these critical desert junctions during the 1932 migration. He dropped low into the dry brush. How many men were waiting? Through the mesquite, he spotted 2 railroad bulls standing in the tower's shade. Vagrancy enforcement in Arizona routinely involved severe beatings before transients were driven back out. He lay motionless on the baked earth. Would they patrol the perimeter? Let me tell you about desert survival, because it dictates the next choice. County coroner reports from 1932 list daytime exposure as the leading killer of unidentified travelers. He had to wait for nightfall. Could his body endure until dark? The sun finally dropped below the horizon, pulling the suffocating heat with it. Desert temperatures famously plummet after dusk, leaving heat-exhausted men vulnerable to sudden hypothermia. He watched the guards light a kerosene lantern. When would they change shifts? He crawled forward, his hands hitting something hard buried in the sand. It was a rusted tin cup dropped by someone who had attempted this exact approach. He slipped it into his pocket. What happened to the man who left it? His mouth was completely dry, a state preceding severe delirium according to period medical journals. He focused on the tower's wooden planks, leaking a slow, rhythmic drip into the dirt. He gripped his empty bottle. Would the dripping mask his steps? The rails began to vibrate against his ribs. A heavy westbound freight was approaching the junction, exactly the kind of deafening mechanical distraction men relied on to move unseen. He pushed himself up into a crouch. Was this his only window? The locomotive thundered past, drowning the desert in the scream of steel and steam. He sprinted the remaining 50 yards using the massive moving shadows to obscure the guard's sightlines. He pressed against the damp pilings. Had they seen his silhouette? He found the secondary runoff valve coated in wet rust. The railroad heavily rationed water in the Gila, making every stolen drop a serious offense. He opened the valve, letting the warm, metallic water fill his bottle. How long before the train passed? The caboose cleared the junction, taking the deafening noise with it. A flashlight beam immediately swept the gravel, passing mere inches from his boots as a guard patrolled the perimeter. He held his breath in the dark. Would the beam swing back? He waited until the boots crunched away toward the station house. He slipped back into the deep brush, his glass bottle finally full. He had survived the junction, but the marked schedule held another warning. What waited at the next stop? The notes skip the next 2 days entirely. When the record resumes, he is 20 miles further west, standing in the ruins of an abandoned silver mining camp. The 1929 crash had emptied these settlements overnight. Why did he stop here? The camp was nothing but decaying timber and rusted corrugated iron. Government surveys from 1932 noted that these ghost towns often became temporary, lawless havens for men avoiding the railroad bulls. He kicked open a sagging door. Who had claimed this territory? Inside the ruined assayer's office, he found fresh ash in a stone hearth. Someone else had survived the Gila crossing and was hiding in these exact ruins. He set the rusted cup he found earlier on a barrel. Would the occupant return? He retreated into the blinding sun, keeping to the shadows of collapsed buildings. Police bulletins warned of violent clashes between men competing for shelter in these abandoned zones. He found a high vantage point. Who was he sharing the ruins with? An hour later, a figure emerged from a dry wash carrying scavenged wood. It was the man from the canvas tarp, the one he had left for dead days ago. He watched silently from the ridge. How had the dying man outpaced him? He realized the dying man must have risked a blind jump onto an express freight, bypassing the water junctions entirely. The mortality rate for blind jumps in 1932 was astronomical. He remained perfectly still on the ridge. Why reveal himself now? He watched the gaunt figure enter the assayer's office. Seconds later, the man stepped back into the sunlight holding the rusted cup left on the barrel. He looked toward the ridge. Did he know he was not alone? This is where the code of the road overwrites regular society. You don't owe your survival to anyone, and you don't collect debts from ghosts. He made no sound against the rocks. He let the man keep his silence. The notes detail a bitter drop in temperature as midnight approached. Records confirmed transients routinely froze in the desert immediately following record heat waves. He shivered against the cooling stone, waiting for dawn. The Gila crossing was almost over. By sunrise, he was walking again, leaving the ghost town far behind. The Southern Pacific tracks finally met the muddy waters of the Colorado River, the documented gateway to California. The most lethal stretch was behind him. What had it cost? The border wasn't open. In 1932, the Los Angeles Police Department established the infamous bum blockade, illegally turning back anyone without visible wealth. He stood in the brush, watching the armed checkpoints. How would he cross the water? The unmarked desert graves are mostly gone now, washed away by flash floods. The official record never documented how many nameless men the Gila swallowed. He was one of the few who walked out, but the notes end before the river. If this is the kind of historical storytelling you want to keep following, subscribe to the channel. More roads, more cases, more of what the official record left out. And if you know this era, this region, or this kind of road, tell us in the comments what you know, what the records missed, what your family remembered that nobody wrote down. The people who lived this history are the reason anyone can reconstruct it. We want to hear from them. The last record that places him near the Colorado River is dated August 1932. After that, nothing. The Southern Pacific line still exists. What he carried forward from Arizona is not recorded. The road doesn't keep that kind of account.